protecting women who are disproportionately victims of gun violence.
These monsters are getting out on bail and killing women. That's on this Liberal government, no matter what they say.
The situation in Canada is becoming increasingly dire. Families are struggling under the weight of soaring living costs, and the government is failing to offer any meaningful relief. Despite the claims of the Liberals and their allies in the NDP, the reality for Canadians is far from rosy. The country's food insecurity has reached alarming levels, with food bank visits up by millions and essential grocery prices climbing due to the carbon tax. A recent report revealed that grocery prices will rise by $800 in the coming year, causing significant financial strain on families already struggling to make ends meet. The government, in its attempt to address this, proposes temporary tax breaks, such as a GST holiday on certain foods, but this feels like a band-aid on a much deeper wound. For many Canadians, the cost of living has become unbearable, with 1 in 4 children living in poverty and families forced to rely on food banks just to get by. Meanwhile, the government continues to argue that their policies are working. Ministers insist that their efforts will lead to economic growth and improved conditions for families. However, the truth is that Canadians are paying the price for these misguided policies. The carbon tax, intended to combat climate change, has led to higher food prices and increased costs for farmers and truckers, further burdening the working class. In the face of these challenges, the opposition is raising their voices. Conservatives are calling for the government to take accountability for its role in this crisis, demanding that it address the mounting deficit and stop printing money to fund its programs. They argue that the Liberals' tax cuts for the wealthy and their failure to support struggling families are proof that their policies are not working. While the Liberals insist they are doing enough, Canadians are not convinced. The holiday season is approaching, and families are worried about how they will afford basic necessities. The government's temporary measures, such as a GST holiday, are seen as too little, too late, and not nearly enough to address the ongoing crisis. As the debate rages on in Parliament, one thing is clear: Canadians are desperate for real solutions, not empty promises. They need a government that will prioritize their needs, not one that continues to pass the buck while the country's most vulnerable suffer. Debates in Parliament intensified as representatives discussed the growing economic crisis affecting Canadians. With rising inflation and skyrocketing food prices, many felt abandoned by a Liberal government that, despite promises of relief, seemed far from understanding the magnitude of the suffering faced by families. Among the most prominent points was the government's excessive spending, which critics argued was contributing to rising deficits and worsening the economic situation. Canadian families are facing the worst quality of life in over 40 years, one member pointed out, while others debated the effects of tax hikes, like the notorious carbon tax, which many saw as a key factor driving up food prices. Government members tried to defend their stance, highlighting job creation and projected economic growth, but the criticism was harsh. They keep saying things will improve next year, but no one believes them. This narrative is no longer credible, one opposition member said, while others joined in, accusing the government of failing to take concrete measures to alleviate the plight of the most vulnerable Canadians. One of the most controversial topics was the proposed temporary tax cuts, which the government had suggested as a solution to relieve families during the holiday season. However, many questioned their effectiveness, arguing that a small discount on non-essential items like treats wouldn't make a real difference to those struggling to make ends meet. Meanwhile, the situation in the provinces hardest hit by food insecurity grew more desperate. In places like Nova Scotia, food bank usage had skyrocketed, with thousands of people struggling to get a meal. The government seems more concerned with political games than with the real needs of Canadians, one opposition member criticized. Amid this chaos, some wondered whether it was time for a shift in the country's economic policy. Growing frustration among citizens seemed to be reaching its boiling point as government leaders clung to their agenda, convinced that their policies would eventually deliver the results Canada needed. However, only time would tell if their promises would turn into reality or if the economic crisis would continue to affect Canadian families, leaving deep scars in the country's social fabric. As the debate raged on, public opinion continued to shift, with many Canadians voicing their frustration on social media and through protest actions. The divide between the government and the opposition seemed to widen as each side blamed the other for the economic downturn. For many citizens, it was becoming clear that a change in leadership might be necessary if real change were to occur. In the midst of the heated discussions, a growing number of Canadians began to demand immediate, actionable solutions to the issues at hand. "People are tired of hearing about plans that are years away," one protester said. "We need relief now. We can't wait any longer." Meanwhile, some economists weighed in, warning that the current trajectory might lead to even greater inequality in the coming months. "The middle class is shrinking," one expert noted, "and unless the government acts quickly, we risk seeing an even greater divide between the rich and the poor." The opposition parties, sensing an opportunity to capitalize on public dissatisfaction, called for a sweeping economic overhaul. Their proposed policies focused on implementing direct cash transfers to families, reducing taxes on basic goods, and rolling back some of the controversial measures, like the carbon tax, which many viewed as regressive. For its part, the Liberal government attempted to reassure the public by emphasizing the importance of long-term stability. But critics remain skeptical, arguing that while the government may have had good intentions, the current policies were simply not working in the short term. As the debate continued, it was clear that Canada was at a crossroads. The public's patience was wearing thin, and the pressure on political leaders was mounting. Whether the government could pivot and address the pressing needs of everyday Canadians, or whether the country would see a shift in leadership, remained uncertain. What was increasingly apparent, however, was that the status quo was no longer sustainable, and Canadians were eager for answers. The coming months would likely determine the future of the nation's economic policies and political landscape, and whether the government could regain the trust of its citizens, or whether it would be replaced by new leadership, driven by the demand for change. As the months went on, public protests became a common sight in major cities across Canada. Crowds gathered outside government buildings, demanding change and accountability. Social media was abuzz with hashtags calling for the resignation of key ministers and the implementation of more immediate relief measures. The pressure on the Liberal government was immense, with many arguing that their promises of long-term solutions were simply not enough to address the pain felt by the average Canadian. In response, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his cabinet tried to calm tensions by presenting a new economic stimulus package. The plan, however, was met with skepticism by both the public and experts, who questioned whether it would be enough to reverse the damage done by previous policies. Some noted that the proposed measures were insufficient to tackle the deeper structural issues facing the economy, such as the rising cost of housing and the stagnation of wages for many working-class Canadians. Meanwhile, opposition leaders seized on the growing discontent. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre was particularly vocal, accusing the government of failing to understand the struggles of ordinary Canadians. His party campaigned on a platform of tax cuts, deregulation, and direct financial aid to those most affected by the economic downturn. Polls showed a growing preference for Poilievre's vision, with many Canadians tired of the Liberal government's perceived inaction. As the political landscape shifted, the business community also began to take notice. Many large corporations, especially in sectors like energy and manufacturing, were concerned about the potential for major policy changes. Some voiced their support for a more market-driven approach, arguing that the government's current policies were stifling growth and innovation. However, smaller businesses and unions sided with the opposition, pushing for policies that would support working families and ease the burdens on everyday Canadians. By the end of the year, the political climate in Canada was at a boiling point. The public outcry against the government had reached its peak, and the opposition seemed poised for a breakthrough. Trudeau's approval ratings continued to plummet, while Poilievre's popularity surged. The stage was set for the next federal election, and it seemed clear that change was coming. Whether the Liberals could regain the trust of the Canadian people or whether the Conservatives would take control of the government was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the status quo was no longer an option, and the country was demanding a new direction.